Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you lost, even though you said everything you wanted to say? You explained yourself, defended your ideas, and poured your thoughts into words, and yet, something inside felt weaker, smaller, like your voice didn't carry the weight you hoped it would. Maybe the other person interrupted you, spoke louder, laughed at the wrong moment, or gave you that condescending smirk that said, "I've already won." And despite all your logic, your clarity, and your effort to stay composed, you left feeling drained, unheard, and strangely defeated. Why? Why is it that the more we try to explain ourselves, the more power we seem to give away? Why is it that those who talk the most often feel the weakest? And here comes the question most people never dare to ask. What if silence, not speech, is the ultimate form of power? What if everything you've been taught about communication, about defending your ideas, about speaking up for yourself, has quietly been robbing you of your strength? Nietzsche, one of the most misunderstood minds in philosophy, believed that the loudest voices often hide the deepest insecurities, that true power doesn't demand to be seen. It doesn't scream, it doesn't plead, it simply is. And in a world addicted to noise, constant talking, explaining, proving, what if the most radical, most dominant thing you could do is to say nothing at all? In this video, we'll explore how silence, when used with mastery, becomes a language stronger than words, a presence that disarms, destabilizes, and ultimately dominates. This is not about staying quiet to avoid conflict. It's about choosing when to speak, and even your silence says more than any argument ever could. You've probably met someone like this. They don't speak much in meetings. They don't raise their voice to command attention. They don't interrupt or insert themselves into every conversation. In fact, they rarely say more than what's absolutely necessary. And yet somehow, they shift the energy of the entire room just by being there. People watch them. People hesitate around them. Even those who love to dominate others lower their tone when this person enters. It's not fear, exactly. It's something deeper, a kind of unspoken authority, a presence that doesn't beg for recognition, because it doesn't need to. You see, we're taught from childhood that if you want to be heard, you have to speak louder, that if you want to win, you have to argue harder, that if you want to be respected, you need to constantly prove yourself. But what if the opposite is true? What if the most powerful people aren't the ones who fight to be seen, but the ones who are too certain of themselves to ever need to? There was a man in my college philosophy class, older than the rest of us, never spoke unless asked. While the rest of us rushed to sound clever, to prove we understood Kant or Descartes or Nietzsche, he simply sat back with a half smile, listening, watching. And yet when he finally did speak, just one line, the entire classroom fell silent. Not because he was loud, not because he had some title or rank, but you could feel the weight of his words. Because it was clear, he had thought deeply, observed carefully, and didn't speak unless he knew his words mattered. That was the first time I realized something that would stay with me forever. Power isn't volume. Power is presence. And presence doesn't come from shouting. It comes from restraint. Nietzsche understood this long before modern psychology caught up. In his writings, he challenged the very foundation of morality and social norms. He warned us that most people are slaves to the herd, to expectations, approval, applause. He called this slave morality, where our actions are driven not by strength, but by fear of rejection. According to Nietzsche, the truly powerful individual, the Übermensch or Overman, is someone who no longer needs to explain themselves, someone who has transcended the emotional chaos of needing to be right, understood, or accepted, someone who imposes reality not by debate, but by existing fully in their truth. He wrote, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." It's a lesson we desperately need in today's world, because somewhere along the way, we started equating noise with confidence. We started believing that constant communication equals leadership. Those who interrupt and dominate conversations are alpha. But more often than not, The people who talk the most are the ones who are trying the hardest to be heard because they don't yet believe in the strength of their own silence. You've seen this too. Maybe at work, maybe in your family, maybe even in yourself. You speak, you explain, you clarify, and still, you feel dismissed. You raise your voice only to feel unheard. You try to prove you're right, but the more you argue, the more you shrink. Why? Because in trying to win the battle with words, you've already lost the war of presence. The people who truly dominate a space don't rely on persuasion. They radiate certainty. They don't need others to validate their worth, because their worth is internalized. And that confidence, quiet, steady, unshakable, is far more intimidating than any angry outburst. Nietzsche would say that the strongest person in the room is the one who has mastered themselves. And when you've done that, you don't need to shout. You don't need to explain. You don't even need to win, because you already have. So here's the problem. Most people confuse speaking with strength. They confuse silence with submission. But that's not silence. That's self-control. That's mastery. And once you understand the difference, everything around you begins to shift. In the next section, we're going to go even deeper, not into the art of speaking, but into the psychological power of staying silent. We'll explore how silence exposes, unravels, and ultimately breaks the defenses of those who try to control the narrative. But first, let this settle. The person who speaks last isn't always the wisest. Sometimes, the wisest never needed to speak at all. Why does silence make people so uncomfortable? Why is it that in the middle of a conversation, when someone suddenly stops responding, pauses, or simply listens without reacting, the atmosphere grows tense, eyes shift, voices rise, jokes get nervous. It's almost as if silence itself becomes louder than any scream. The reason is simple, but terrifying. Silence is a mirror, and most people cannot bear to look into it. When you choose to remain silent in a world obsessed with reaction, you are no longer playing the game others expect you to play. You are stepping outside the script, rejecting the unwritten contract that says, if I speak, you must respond. If I provoke, you must react. And that's exactly where the panic begins. Because most people don't talk to express themselves. They talk to protect their insecurities, to mask the chaos inside, to reinforce a narrative they desperately need to believe. When you don't respond, you deny them that comfort. You force them to sit in their own echo, their own noise, their own illusion. And that silence, that void, it terrifies them. Nietzsche, always unflinchingly honest, said, most people don't seek the truth, they seek power. Think about that for a second. When someone argues with you, are they really trying to understand? Or are they trying to win? When someone demands a response, is it because they care about your thoughts? Or because your silence makes them question their own? The truth is, we've all been conditioned by society, by upbringing, by fear, to believe that silence means weakness. Not answering is surrender. That if we don't defend ourselves, we'll be dismissed, erased, or forgotten. But that belief doesn't come from strength. It comes from a deep-rooted fear of rejection. We talk too much because we're afraid to be invisible. We explain ourselves endlessly because we think silence will make us unlovable. We react to everything because we confuse the absence of reaction with the absence of value. But here's the paradox. The more you speak from that fear, the more power you give away. Every unnecessary explanation, every emotional defense, every reactive outburst becomes an unintentional confession. I care too much about your opinion of me. Nietzsche called this herd morality, a moral code designed not by strength, but by survival. It's the morality of the afraid, of the many who conform, those who seek safety in numbers, applause in agreement, and validation through obedience. But the Übermensch, the higher human, breaks free from that. He no longer needs the approval of the crowd. He no longer dances to the rhythm of validation. He doesn't live to be liked. He lives to be whole. And that's where silence becomes dangerous. Because when you stop reacting, people no longer know where to place you. They can't control you. They can't predict you. They can't pull your emotional strings. So what happens next? They project. They project their doubts, fears, and insecurities onto you. Why isn't he saying anything? Is he judging me? Does he think he's better than me? Am I wrong? Am I weak? The silence becomes a psychological battleground where the only weapon used is self-control, and the only casualties are illusions. This is why silence is not passivity. It's precision. It's psychological warfare for those who've mastered their own minds. To sit in silence without feeling the need to prove, to defend, to correct. This is one of the highest forms of power. And it's not because you don't have something to say. It's because you no longer need to say it. You are no longer reacting. You are observing. And in that quiet space, everyone else reveals themselves. So next time you feel the urge to jump into a conversation, to explain your worth, to justify your thoughts, pause, watch, wait. Listen not with the intent to reply, but with the presence of someone who no longer depends on external noise to feel whole. Because the one who can sit in stillness while the world around them spirals in insecurity, that person is no longer a participant in the chaos. They are the calm eye in the storm. And that is where real power begins. Now that we understand why silence is so powerful, how it disorients, reflects, and unravels, it's time to learn how to use it, not as a passive withdrawal, but as a deliberate, strategic tool. What we're talking about here isn't shutting down. It's a sharpening presence. This is the art of active silence, where every pause, every withheld word, every quiet moment becomes a calculated move. Let's break this down into 4 weapons of mastery. Weapon 1, silence in the face of provocation. When someone provokes you, what's the first thing your body wants to do? React, defend, justify, maybe even explode. But Nietzsche knew better. He understood that the person who controls their emotions, especially under pressure, controls the room. When someone attacks you verbally and you respond with silence, not fear, not retreat, but centered, calm stillness, you're doing something most people can't. You're breaking the pattern. You're refusing to let someone else decide your emotional state. That moment of silence disarms them. It unsettles them. Why? Because they expected resistance. Instead, they're left standing alone with their anger, their manipulation, and their insecurity exposed. This is power, not in volume, but in restraint. Weapon 2, deep observation. Nietzsche once said, "He who observes is more dangerous than he who speaks." The observer sees the game from above, while the talker is trapped inside it. When you go silent, you unlock something few people practice today. The art of watching deeply. You listen, not just to words, but to body language, tone, contradictions, inconsistencies, desperation disguised as confidence. You become the strategist, the psychological hunter, not hunting to harm, but to understand. And here's the key. People always reveal themselves, especially when they think you're not reacting. The more you hold silence, the more the other person talks to fill it, and the more likely they are to reveal what they're hiding. In that space, you gather insight. You collect emotional data. You become someone no one can easily manipulate, because you see too much and say too little. Weapon 3, extended pauses to build pressure. There is nothing more unnerving than a pause that lasts too long. When you stop talking, especially in a tense moment, and let the silence stretch, it creates a psychological vacuum. The human brain hates unresolved tension. It needs closure. And in that space of uncertainty, people project. They assume. They unravel. Imagine someone insults you in front of others, expecting a fiery response. And instead, you look at them, say nothing, and hold eye contact. The room shifts. People grow uncomfortable. Not because you failed to respond, but because your silence screamed louder than any words ever could. It becomes a form of controlled chaos. You are no longer the defender. You are the silent judge, forcing others to confront themselves. This technique is subtle, but when used with intention, it becomes devastatingly effective. Weapon 4. Become unpredictable. Predictability is a weakness. When people know how you'll respond, they control you. They bait you. They use your own emotional programming against you. But when you stop reacting on cue, when you become emotionally ambiguous, unreadable, unpredictable, you reclaim your psychological territory. Maybe today you won't respond at all. Maybe tomorrow you calmly walk away. Maybe next week you speak a single sentence with surgical precision, but no one knows for sure. This uncertainty shifts the power dynamic. People become cautious around you, not because you're dangerous, but because you're not available for manipulation. Your silence becomes not just a shield, but a fog, a space they can't fully enter or control. And from within that fog, you gain room to move, to think, to choose, rather than react. These 4 strategies aren't just clever tricks. They are expressions of self-mastery. You're not silencing yourself because you're afraid. You're silencing yourself because you've realized something profound. Not everything deserves your energy. Not every battle is yours to fight. Not every attack requires a defense. In fact, the strongest message you can send in a chaotic world is stillness. Presence. Command without control. Power without noise. The Übermensch, as Nietzsche envisioned, doesn't react like everyone else. He doesn't answer every insult. He doesn't chase validation. He doesn't fear misunderstanding. His silence is a fortress, built not to hide, but to radiate. And once you begin to practice this kind of silence, active, focused, undeniable, you'll notice a shift, not just in others, but in yourself. Your mind gets quieter, your confidence rises, and your influence begins to speak without ever saying a word. Not all silence is strength. There's a kind of silence that feels solid, grounded in intention, rooted in clarity. It's the silence of someone who knows who they are and who doesn't need to prove it. But there's another kind of silence, a quieter one, a more dangerous one. The kind that doesn't come from wisdom, but from fear. And that silence? That's not power. That's submission. In today's world, silence is often praised as mature. We hear phrases like, take the high road. Let it go and don't stoop to their level. And yes, there is truth in that. Sometimes silence is the most powerful thing you can offer. But what if for many people, silence isn't a strength they're choosing, but a cage they've been trained to live in? Nietzsche called it slave morality. According to him, slave morality is the value system born from powerlessness. When the weak cannot overcome the strong, they invert the rules. They call humility a virtue, obedience a strength, and silence a sign of goodness. In reality, it's fear dressed up as ethics. We stop defending ourselves, not because we've evolved, but because we're afraid. We stop expressing truth, not because we found peace, but because we fear rejection. We stay silent, not out of confidence, but out of conditioning. And the world applauds this because it's easier to control a person who doesn't speak. But here's the hard truth. If your silence is motivated by fear, it's not maturity, it's a learned survival strategy. So many people walk around believing they're above conflict, when really they're just exhausted from being ignored. They claim to be peaceful, when what they really feel is invisible. They've convinced themselves that keeping quiet is noble. But deep down, they ache with the weight of things they never said. This kind of silence is not chosen, it's absorbed. It's taught through years of being punished for speaking up, of watching louder voices take the space, of learning that discomfort follows honesty. So we silence ourselves preemptively. We play small to keep the peace. We disappear from our own lives just to avoid confrontation. But in doing so, we pay the highest price. We lose ourselves. Nietzsche warned us about this. He saw that most people don't act from strength. They act from the fear of being excluded, unloved, or condemned. And so, they adopt the morality of the herd. They learn to follow, to agree, to go silent, not because it's right, but because it's safe. But there's nothing virtuous about betraying your own voice. Let's get clear. There's a profound difference between silence born of self-mastery and silence born of self-erasure. One is a choice. The other is a reflex. One stems from inner strength. The other is from deep programming. You've felt both, haven't you? The silence felt powerful, like a storm being held back, a boundary held firm. And the silence that felt suffocating, like swallowing your truth just to keep the illusion of harmony alive. Only you know which silence you're practicing right now. So ask yourself, are you staying quiet because you're grounded? Or because you're scared? Are you withholding your truth because it's strategic? Or because you've been conditioned to believe your truth doesn't matter? Here's what happens when silence becomes submission. You stop participating in your own story. You begin existing in the background of your own life. You trade authenticity for approval, and the world doesn't even notice you're fading. They just keep benefiting from your absence. And so, slowly, your identity becomes shaped by what others need from you instead of who you truly are. Nietzsche didn't write for people who wanted to be liked. He wrote for people who wanted to be free. He didn't speak to the crowd. He spoke to the individual willing to face themselves, to break from the herd, to reject the lie that silence always equals virtue. Because true silence, the kind that commands respect, is not afraid. It's not fragile. It doesn't seek approval. It creates presence. So let this be the turning point. If your silence has been protecting your fear, it's time to kill it. Let it die. And let a new kind of silence be born in its place. The silence of someone who doesn't shrink anymore. The silence of someone who doesn't owe anyone an explanation. The silence of someone who finally knows, I don't have to speak to exist, but when I do, it will shake the ground beneath you. That is the silence Nietzsche would have respected. That is the silence of the one who has taken back their life. From this day forward, your silence is no longer an absence. It is no longer a void filled with doubt, hesitation, or fear of being misunderstood. It is no longer a placeholder for the approval you hoped someone else would give you. No. Your silence is now your presence, your authority, your declaration that you no longer live by the gaze of others. There is a kind of quiet that comes from pain, from shrinking, from being told over and over that your voice doesn't matter, that your ideas aren't welcome, that your truth is inconvenient. Many people live in that silence for years, some for a lifetime, but you don't have to. You now understand the difference between submission and sovereignty, between being silent because you're afraid, and choosing silence because you're finally in control. That's a revolution few people ever reach. Nietzsche didn't write for the masses. He didn't write for those who needed permission to exist or who waited to be chosen. He wrote for the rare few who are willing to become, to step out of the moral safety of the herd and into the terrifying, electrifying clarity of self-creation. He wrote for the Übermensch, the overman, the human who transcends the need to belong, the one who doesn't react to the world, but redefines it by how they move through it. The Übermensch does not ask, "Do you understand me?" He says, "This is who I am, whether you understand or not." That is the kind of presence that speaks louder than any speech. That is the kind of silence that shakes the ground without raising a voice. And it is yours, if you choose it. So let me ask you now, not rhetorically, but truly, soul to soul, are you ready to own your presence? Are you ready to stop folding yourself into what others expect? Are you ready to stop apologizing for your strength, your vision, your calm? Are you ready to speak only when it matters and let your silence do the rest? Because the world you were born into trains you to react. It wants you loud when you're afraid. It makes you passive when you're angry. It wants you to be explainable, predictable, easy to decode, and controllable. But you are not here to be decoded. You are here to be felt. The calmest person in the room is often the most dangerous, because they are the ones not being pulled by the strings of chaos. That's what you're becoming. A person who doesn't react to noise, but reshapes it with their very stillness. A person who chooses their words not from fear of being wrong, but from the power of knowing they don't need to be right to be whole. You are not here to win arguments. You are here to embody truth. That is a higher calling. That is what Nietzsche meant when he wrote for the few who could break free, not just from others, but from themselves. So no more shrinking, no more apologizing, no more silences filled with guilt. From now on, let your silence speak of presence. Let it announce your sovereignty without saying a word. Let it be the space where others see themselves more clearly, not because you told them who they are, but because you showed them who you are. And in a world that shouts constantly, you, silent, strong, unshaken, become unforgettable. This is your power. This is your awakening. And if you've made it this far, I ask you to answer not just with your thoughts, but with your will. Are you ready to command your presence? Are you ready to live as someone whose silence no longer hides them, but reveals their strength? Then speak it below. Not for me, but for yourself. Write it, I choose the silence that commands respect. Because the world doesn't need another voice seeking attention. It needs your silence anchored in truth, shaped by mastery, and ready to move mountains without a single sound. If this message stirred something in you, if it reminded you of your own strength, your presence, your right to exist unapologetically, then don't let it stop here. Like this video to let the algorithm know we need more content that wakes people up. Subscribe to the channel to receive more powerful insights on philosophy, psychology, and self-mastery. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Tell me what part hit you the hardest, what lesson you're walking away with, or how silence has shaped your life. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today.